Hello, everyone. Welcome to this first webinar for our spring quarter here at UCLA. It's great to have everybody online. And so we're going to get started. And I'm going to do first land acknowledgement. The Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga people. So we're very excited about launching this webinar series for this spring quarter. As everybody know, of course, there's so many news, so we're competing for the attention of everybody. But we wanted to really focus this quarter on the current ongoing negotiations of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. I know there are many angles, and we're very fortunate to have a guest speaker who's been following this up close. So I think everybody will enjoy it and find this webinar very informative. So I want to welcome Sandra Polaski, who's non-residential senior fellow at the Global Economic Governance Initiative at the Boston University, the Global Development Policy Center. Currently, Sandra is in Paris, so thank you for being flexible. I know it's at night there. And maybe you can also tell us a little bit how you got to this research, and then you're going to do a PowerPoint presentation. So the floor is yours, Sandra. Welcome, and thank you for being here.
Well, good afternoon, Gaspar, and all those who are online. Good evening, my time. Good afternoon, your time. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my work with the UCLA community on USMCA and the need to build the second story of Mexican wages and household incomes. Let me bring up my PowerPoint here, and then I will tell you a bit more about how I came to this work. So hopefully that's up now and people can see it. So, well, I have worked on the relationship between trade and labor and social impacts and the outcomes for workers for a long period of time in different jobs. I am at Boston University now, non-resident. I retired from the International Labor Organization in Geneva, where I was the Deputy Director General in charge of policy. And we did work on, obviously, on labor issues in terms of globalization, in terms of labor standards, and trade. Certainly, Mexico was part of my focus then. Before that, I was the Undersecretary of Labor for International Affairs at the US Department of Labor, again, where I worked with Mexico and many other countries to try to improve the impact of trade and economic integration on workers. Going way back before that, I was at the NAFTA Labor Secretariat, which existed for a few years when NAFTA was first launched, and I was the director of research there. So I got to know Mexico very well, the excellent economists, statisticians, and lawyers from Mexico who were my colleagues there. I've been following these negotiations very closely from the time, as I mentioned, around NAFTA, but then also the renegotiation of the USMCA in 18, 19, and 2020. And I have also been on the Independent Mexico Labor Expert Board, which was appointed by the US Congress to advise the US government and the US Congress on how things were developing in Mexico with respect to labor standards and wages. So a lot of familiarity, a great love for Mexico, and a great interest in contributing to the degree possible. So the paper that I have written, and I'll show you at the end of the talk how to get copies in English or Spanish, is titled USMCA and the Need to Build the Second Story of Mexican Wages and Household Incomes. This title actually combines two important topics. One, what is the relationship between the USMCA and Mexican wages? And second, why, in my opinion, Mexico needs to improve wages and household incomes for its own reasons, for its own benefits, both social but also economic. And so I'll go through a few aspects of the relationship between USMCA and Mexican wages, and then talk about the evolution of Mexican wages and incomes over the period before Presidents Lopez Obrador and Sheinbaum changed the policy, the steps that they have taken to increase minimum wages, then talk about the fact that average wages nonetheless have continued to stagnate. What were the causes of that, and what has been the overall impact, not only on the households, not only on social equity, but as a challenge for Mexican economic growth and development overall. And then I will present 6 policy areas where the government could take very concrete steps to begin addressing the need to build a second story. And then come back to a conclusion about the relationship again between USMCA and this opportunity for reform. So why are Mexican wages an issue in the USMCA review? For those old enough to have been around when NAFTA was being negotiated, they might remember the phrase giant sucking sound, that jobs would be sucked out of the US into Mexico because of low wages. It was a political issue then. It was a political issue when USMCA was being renegotiated. And as recently as last week, a bipartisan group of senators wrote to the Commerce Department asking for an investigation because they complained that US agricultural machinery manufacturers like Caterpillar and John Deere have been shutting US plants, have been laying off US workers, moving to Mexico in order to take advantage of lower wages there. So the link between Mexican wages and trade, whether NAFTA or USMCA, has been there all the way through. Over time, a lot of empirical evidence has accumulated about the effect of NAFTA on the US, which consistently finds that those communities in the US that were most exposed to trade with Mexico because of the industries there suffered documented job losses, significant wage declines, and negative social consequences in health and other measures. Trump, when he was candidate Donald Trump running for office in 2016, weaponized that discontent and vowed to fix the problems. And actually, by most analyses, he won that election by carrying Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which were all states that had seen a big job loss. He got elected, he did renegotiate, and there are provisions in the USMCA which were designed both to bring jobs back, which he had promised, and to raise Mexican wages. So let's just take a look at how those Mexican wages have evolved over the years from, this figure is from 1994 through 2024. How have Mexican wages evolved compared to the US? Trade theory says that if a high wage, high income country merges with a low wage, low income country, the wages will converge if they're using the same technology. And of course, in the export sectors, by and large, they are using the same technology. That hasn't happened. What you see on the screen is that from 1994 rather, through 2024, basically the average annual wages in Mexico have been flat, starting from a level that was a little bit better based on things that had happened in Mexico before the neoliberal period, if you want to call it that, of the 80s and 90s, but basically flat over that entire period, whereas US wages and Canadian wages continued to grow. And therefore the gap between the wages in Mexico and the US actually have become wider under the two agreements. Excuse me, we went too fast. So how does the USMCA review in 2026 relate to what Mexico might do now on wages? I argue that, first of all, it provides an impetus to Mexico to take action now. Because this lack of upward convergence of Mexican wages has been a key irritant in the relationship. It is an issue in the USMCA review this year. And it's one area where the interests of Mexico and the US converge. Higher wages in Mexico will be good for Mexico, and they will be good for the US in the sense that it narrows the gap. It's also an impetus because the attention on the USMCA and the fact that it will be reviewed and perhaps renegotiated this year, it spotlights how dependent Mexico is on exports to the US market, which leaves the country very vulnerable to US demands, whether those demands are reasonable, increased wages, or unreasonable. But it leaves Mexico vulnerable. The weak domestic demand based on these low wages has created a longstanding vulnerability, making Mexico reliant on exports. That now poses even heightened risks under an unpredictable US administration. In addition to providing an impetus, reasons to do this, I think it provides an important tactical opportunity for Mexico, because raising wages is always a political economic issue. It's going to be resisted by firms and by elites that want to keep what they have. They don't want to raise wages. But preserving the USMCA is a higher order priority for those sectors. And that creates political space for the Mexican government to act now, to take measures, take steps that can raise wages and household incomes. Beyond the immediate tactical opportunity, I think it also provides a strategic opportunity, because raising wages will increase households' ability to consume, increasing domestic demand, which gradually over time can reduce Mexico's reliance on exports, specifically exports to the US market, which is overwhelmingly the case. And that can increase Mexico's economic autonomy to do a policy as it sees fit. So that's a bit about the relationship, why Mexican wages and USMCA have a relationship that has been there and is not going away. So now let's look at the second part of the question, why Mexico needs to raise wages and household incomes. I would argue for its own reasons, in addition to anything having to do with the trade relationship. So Mexican wages have been depressed because from the 1980s until 2018, Mexico followed an economic strategy of export-led growth. That was its development and economic strategy, and it was based on low wages. A key policy instrument that the government used during that period was the extreme repression of the minimum wage. So from 1980 to 1995, the minimum wage lost 66% of its purchasing power. And after that, stagnated at that low level for decades. The results of that export-led growth strategy was strong growth in exports, as would be expected, but slow growth of the overall economy more broadly, and very high levels of poverty and inequality. The administrations of President López Obrador and President Sheinbaum reversed that wage strategy to focus on poverty alleviation by using the minimum wage as a tool to do that. So for those who don't follow Mexican politics all the time, there may not be anyone in the room like that, but let me explain what I mean by first story or primer piso. This is a favored metaphor of President Sheinbaum. She talks about the fact that López Obrador, her predecessor, built the first story of the fourth transformation of Mexico, what they call the fourth transformation, meaning the policy to step away from the neoliberal policies and neoliberal period and work to be a country that has more equity, more inclusion. So President Sheinbaum says that López Obrador built the first story of the transformation, and she intends to build the second story, segundo piso. So the metaphor applies very, very well to this question of wages and household incomes. So the first story was built, or is being built, by very dramatic increases in the minimum wage, beginning shortly after López Obrador took office in December 2018. So this chart shows you from 2015 through 2026, the increase in the minimum wage. The dark blue bars are the wage covering the most of the country, the general minimum wage. And the light blue bars are the minimum wage for the northern border region where cost of living is higher. As you see, the top bar is 2015, 16, 17, 18, very, very small increases in the minimum wage. But then from January 1, 2019, you begin to see these much larger increases. You see the blue bar, the creation of a new wage for the northern border, which quite literally doubled the wage that was applicable to that region in 1 year, if you can imagine. But then continued very large increases through all these years, including most recently at the bottom of the chart, January 1, 2026. So very dramatic steps taken to increase the minimum wage. The minimum wage is important and has substantial impact because it is the actual wage that's paid to about 1/3 of Mexican workers. Not only does it set that floor, but that in fact is what workers take home as their pay. As a result of this policy shift during the 6-year term of López Obrador, over 13 million people were lifted out of poverty in Mexico. And very careful econometric studies show that the increase in the minimum wage itself was responsible for half of that, for lifting 6.6 million people out of poverty, with increases in pensions and other social programs contributing the rest of the reduction. So very important progress, but more to be done. The construction of this foundational primer piso first story is not yet complete. The minimum wage does not yet provide an income sufficient to lift a household out of poverty in most parts of the country. 34% of the population still live in working poverty, meaning they have people who have jobs who go to work, but they are still in poverty because of the low wages. President Sheinbaum has endorsed the goal that by 2030, at the end of her term, the general minimum wage should cover 2.5 basic consumption baskets. Basic consumption basket covers food, housing, and basic needs for one person. So covering 2.5 would be the beginning of something like a family wage. Maybe not all the way there, but significant. If 2 people in a household work, yes, you could talk about that being a family living wage. To get there, to get to that 2.5 goal by 2030 will require further double-digit increases every year from now until then. Notwithstanding these very dramatic and important increases in the minimum wage, the average wages in Mexico have grown much more slowly, in fact, have almost stagnated. The overall average base wage increased by only 3.8% a year from January 1, 2019 through September 25, compared to the increase in the minimum wage, which was 16% a year, more than 4 times greater, and 28% in the northern region over that same period. Because of those big increases in the minimum, the lowest income households saw real income growth, and we saw that households coming out of poverty. But because of this relative stagnation of the average wage, most households did not see that result. And 2/3 of Mexican workers earn more than the minimum wage. So most households continue to face relative income stagnation. Here's a figure that illustrates that. So starting on the left, 2018, this is the wage before López Obrador took office. The minimum wage was 26% of the average wage. There was only one minimum, so it was 26% both in the north and the rest of the country. That big jump in 2019, 50% of the northern border region average, that was the doubling of that minimum wage, and then with continued increases, so that now, as of January, the minimum wage in the northern border region is 63% of the average wage. In the rest of the country is the lower bar, so the minimum wage is now about 48%. What this means is that the minimum wage has been growing, but the average wages they're kept a lid on the average wages. They haven't gone up. So the minimum wage is taking over. It means more people are living on the minimum wage and not seeing further increases. Why do we see this stagnation of average wages and the lack of this segundo piso of household incomes? There are a number of reasons. I want to highlight three very important ones here. First is monopsonistic labor markets. So monopoly is when sellers collaborate, when one seller or a couple collaborate to dominate a market for selling. Monopsony is when employers, one or a few employers dominate hiring, buying labor. When they do that, they can collude to keep wages low and to capture a disproportionately great share of the value added and productivity gains. Numerous studies have found that many labor markets in Mexico are highly concentrated and monopsonistic, giving firms this asymmetric power to determine wage levels. And theoretical models show that concentration in labor markets like that not only depresses wages, but it also depresses job creation. Another important factor is informality. About 54% of jobs in Mexico, as most of you probably know, are in the informal sector. The minimum wage applies to all workers, regardless of sector, but enforcement in the informal sector is extremely weak. And so there is some pass-through of the minimum wage, but not fully, and worker bargaining power there is very limited. A third very important factor is that the bargaining institutions for workers in the formal sector are very weak. Only about 12% of Mexican workers are represented by unions. And even where they have unions, in many cases, they are corrupt unions who negotiate what are called protection contracts that protect the employer, not the workers. So quite literally corruption to keep wages low and to keep independent unions out. So these are among the causes of why we've seen this stagnation of wages. In terms of the impact, this slow growth of average real wages explains the picture that you saw at the beginning, the figure of the failure of Mexican wages to converge upward toward wages in the US, which is, again, a major and continuing source of tensions. To put this in perspective, in terms of the realm of what's possible, the growth of average real wages in Mexico lags that of all other G20 upper middle income economies. Brazil, China, Indonesia, Turkey, countries, emerging middle income economies in all parts of the world with different kinds of economies, they have all seen faster wage growth than in Mexico. In many cases, much, much faster wage growth. Chinese wages now, you may know, are in manufacturing are 40% higher than Mexican wages in manufacturing. A broad way of looking at this, of measuring the impact, can be found in the labor income share. The labor income share is the share of GDP, the overall economy, that goes to workers as compensation for their labor. So an economy by this measure is made up of the labor income share and the capital income share. Labor gets part, the owners of capital, investors, owners of companies get returns on capital. This is known as the functional distribution of national income, and it's an important metric to understand an economy at the macroeconomic level. So let's take a look at that. Mexico has one of the lowest labor shares in the world and one of the highest shares going to owners of capital as profit. So looking at the figure on the right, this is a selection of countries, the neighbors of Mexico in North America, and some other emerging economies. So what you see on the left, Brazil, the labor income share is 60%, about the same in Canada, 56% in the US, over 51% in China, the same in Argentina, and only 36.9% of the overall economy in Mexico. So dramatically lower than in the region or in comparable economies. A low labor share, as you can imagine, is a strong measure of overall inequality, meaning who gets what. The capital gets 2/3 and labor gets 1/3. But it's also important because it limits domestic consumption. With that maldistribution of income, households can consume less, and this becomes overall an important factor in Mexico's low economic growth and dependence on exports, on other markets instead of the domestic market. So let's take a look at that slow economic growth for a moment. Mexico's economy has grown at about 2% per year over the last 30 years, which is lower than almost all other emerging economies. Um, and the IMF and others project that Mexico is going to continue to grow more slowly than other emerging and developing countries this year and next year, as far as their projections go. This cumulative impact leaves the country far behind its peers. So looking at the figure, this is an index where 2000 equals 100 of the real growth of GDP per capita. So the economy has grown about 2% a year. The per capita, meaning the population growth, has been the same or greater, meaning that Mexico's growth has been basically flat over that entire period, 25 years, a quarter of a century. As you can see, China's growth during that time skyrocketed, not least because of these very large wage increases in China, which began about 2003 and continued. ASEAN, Southeast Asia, not as strong as China, but much stronger growth than Mexico, more than twice as much. The Latin American country average, again, much higher than Mexico. So all of these factors weave together to produce this picture of low household income, poverty, inequality, economic stagnation. So to take a closer look at that slow growth in order to be able to begin looking at solutions to it. Some of you may remember from your Economics 101 class, one way of looking at an economy, which is called the expenditure method, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. That's consumption plus investment plus government spending plus export minus imports adds up to the total GDP of an economy. So let's look at where Mexico is in each one of those components. Consumption is the largest share of the economy, over 2/3, but it's not dynamic. It's held back by this low labor share and the weak growth of the average household incomes. Investment has been sluggish, again, over this long period of time. Investment for domestic consumption is sluggish precisely because of this sluggish domestic demand. If workers don't have steady increases in their income, they don't see increases coming. The demand remains very, very cautious and conservative. Investors don't see any reason to increase investment for production because they don't see it's a vicious circle. And in terms of foreign direct investment, well, if it's for domestic consumption, the same problem, the same picture. And if it's for trade, because of this trade uncertainty, which has only grown greater. So even with the short spike in investment that came with nearshoring, the so-called nearshoring, after the US and China began to engage more intensely in this trade war, some investment came to produce in Mexico rather than in China. But even with that, investment in Mexico, private sector investment in Mexico is about 21% of the economy, of GDP, compared to an average in other emerging economies of 28% and below the level of around 25%, which is considered necessary for an economy to show takeoff, to begin into a sustained pattern of growth, which is real. Government spending, the next component of the economy, is low. For example, public investment by the government is about 3% of GDP in Mexico, twice as high in other emerging economies at about 6%. And government spending is limited because of a low tax take. Taxes in Mexico are very low, the lowest in the OECD. So you come to the final component that Mexico has relied on so strongly for growth, trade, exports minus imports. That's the way trade is measured with respect to an overall economy, because imports, in effect, mean that those goods that are consumed as imports were not produced in the local economy. So they don't add to the GDP, they don't add jobs, and they don't add household income. Imports. Exports do. But in the case of Mexico, when you take exports minus imports, the overall impact of trade on the economy is very little on the economy and on job creation, because Mexico continues to follow this maquila model where they import a very substantial portion, the large majority of the inputs for what they then assemble and exports. So there are not the backward and forward linkages in the domestic economy that would create jobs. I argue that stronger economic growth at the macroeconomic level requires progress on wages and domestic demand. As an upper middle income country with a population of 132, 133 million, Mexico has the heft to shift away from the export-led growth model. And the risk of remaining in this slow growth trap that Mexico has been mired in for a quarter of a century or more really should suggest that this shift is overdue, and the risks of dependence on the US export demand will only make that problem worse. I mean, there's not a solution in sight by continuing to depend on exports. But in order to expand the domestic consumption, the C, as a major driver of its economy, Mexico is going to have to increase labor incomes for a much broader swath of workers and households over and above, i.e. the second story of the progress that was made for the 1/3 of workers who are getting the minimum wage. So how to do that? How can Mexico build this second story of household incomes? Let me suggest 6 policy areas where Mexico could take very practical, very concrete steps, each of which would help contribute to increasing incomes. Collectively could do a lot to increase incomes and get momentum in that direction. The first step is to continue and consolidate the growth of the minimum wages to at least the 2.5 consumption baskets by 2030. As I mentioned earlier, over 1/3 of people live in households that are in working poverty. And so even though it seems to many in Mexico, certainly to the business class, that continued double-digit increases in the minimum wage seem too high to them, it's absolutely necessary to even get to this level where the minimum wage begins to be a family wage. Then to begin the construction of the second story, Mexico should create a new minimum wage policy for export sectors and exporting firms. The dualism of the Mexican economy, where there are high productivity, high profit firms, mainly in the export sector, and lower productivity, small and medium firms focused on the domestic market, provides a strong rationale for a higher minimum wage requirement for the export sectors and firms. One way to do this would be to raise the minimum wage for the region covered by the general minimum wage, most of the country, to raise that vis-a-vis the exporting firms to the 2.5 basic consumption baskets now, without waiting 5 more years to eliminate working poverty. These are firms that are integrated into North American supply chains. They are highly profitable. They should not be paying workers poverty wages. This implies an increase of 21%. That would be the minimum wage in exporting firms compared to the wage applicable to non-exporting firms. And then I would argue it should be increased each year in steps as the general minimum wage goes up until it covers at least 3 baskets by 2030, again, approximating a family wage, minimum family wage. In the northern border region, where the cost of living is so much higher, raise the minimum wage for exporting firms to 3.5 basic consumption baskets now, again, a 21% increase over the northern border minimum wage, and then increase it in steps to cover at least 4 basic consumption baskets by 2030, and require that all employees of export firms are formal workers, registered for Social Security and for coverage by all of the labor laws. Beyond direct action on wages that the government could take, that I've just described, it's also going to be very important to reform the labor law to address this asymmetry of workers' bargaining power and to offset the monopsony in labor markets. The federal labor law was reformed in 2019 in ways that were meant to strengthen worker rights, to form unions and to bargain collectively without protection in unionism to address that problem. It was also an explicit requirement of the USMCA. But after 6 years of experience, it's clear that there are important gaps and ambiguities in the law. For example, the government has not imposed sanctions when worker rights are violated, even when they acknowledge there has been a violation, claiming that the authority to do so is not clear in the law. Without sanctions, without fines on companies that violate the law, there is no cost to violators. And therefore, there's no deterrence effect that would lead other firms to voluntarily comply with the law. So reforms to the labor law continue to be needed. Even with those reforms, there will be much work still to be done for Mexico to build the institutional capacity to address this asymmetry of bargaining power and monopsony. The government has made some significant efforts over the last 6 years, but they still do not have adequate state capacity to monitor, to inspect, to sanction, and to remedy violations of worker rights. The Labor Secretariat, STPS by the Mexican acronym, has 1.1 labor inspectors for every 100,000 workers, compared to an average of 4.1 inspectors per 100,000 in upper middle income countries as a group. So most countries have 4 times as many inspectors as Mexico, countries in the same income category. Many of the state labor bodies in Mexico suffer from extreme labor shortages, and some have no labor inspectors at all. The Federal Center, which is the body that was created as a result of the 2019 reform, and again is a requirement of USMCA, and oversees the question of freedom of association, workers trying to form unions or get rid of corrupt unions and bring in independent unions, collective bargaining. It is very badly understaffed, and many of the positions are temporary and low paid, which leads to staff turnover and the risk of corruption. Another area, another policy area where Mexico could take very concrete steps is to build compliance with labor law and wages into Plan Mexico. Plan Mexico is the government's industrial policy, its economic strategy for this sessionio, this term. And it aims to attract more foreign and domestic investment into specific industries and regions through tax incentives provided to those firms. It identifies creating well-paid jobs as one of its main overall goals and part of its mission, but it doesn't include any measures to achieve this, to create well-paid jobs, to make sure that the jobs, in fact, are created and that they are paid well. The government should require firms to formally commit to compliance with all of the terms of labor law, the minimum wages, and respect for workers' bargaining rights as a condition for receiving the incentives, and the government should continue to monitor to ensure their compliance and withdraw the benefits if they fail. Now, this will require correcting these deficits in labor inspection and deterrence that I've already identified if these tax incentives are to pay off in terms of creating formal quality jobs. And one final policy area that I propose that Mexico should act is to leverage the USMCA's rapid response labor mechanism to reinforce Mexico's own efforts to improve household incomes and wages. The RRLM is a very innovative enforcement tool that uses access to the US and Canadian markets as leverage to achieve compliance with labor rights. It has already been used 45 times in the short 6 years of USMCA with mainly positive results. However, when the complaints cannot be resolved, they go to an independent labor panel to determine if there's been a violation. And at that stage, the process has become mired in jurisdictional and procedural issues, basically that have been thrown up by the Mexican Secretary of the Economy that damage the rapidity of the mechanism and delay remedy for the workers. And the US has announced that it will seek to strengthen the mechanism in this year's review. Mexico should be open to modifications and should see the mechanism as a backstop and as a complement to its own efforts while it builds the necessary state capacity for labor enforcement and worker rights. So drawing this all together, as a large upper middle income country, Mexico has a heft to shift away from the export-led growth model As I've argued, this is overdue to escape this low growth trap that it has been in for so long. And the profound uncertainty created by changing US trade policies only amplifies the risk that they would face if they cling to this export-led model. Instead, to expand C, domestic consumption demand as a major driver of GDP of the overall economy and a dynamic and growing driver, Mexico should adopt a range of policies to increase labor incomes for a broader swath of workers and households beyond those who get the minimum wage. And again, I argue that USMCA, the review this year, provides a strategic opportunity to do that because the failure of upward convergence of Mexican wages will be on the agenda, and because Mexico can leverage this to overcome their own domestic opposition from the elites and from firms to these kinds of policies that I have described, which of course they will try to resist. So Mexico should pursue wage growth both for its own benefit and to find common ground with the US on an issue where the self-interest of both countries converges. Let me just say this is available again in English and in Spanish at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center website. The title is the same as the title of this webinar. So thank you, and over to you, Gaspar.
Thank you so much, Sandra, for a very provocative and well thought presentation. I maybe to get going and just remind everybody, if you have any questions, please join the conversation by typing your question in the Q&A icon. And maybe if you want to stop sharing your screen so we can be back online, and we'll put, and I'm gonna ask also Artie to put that link into the chat so everybody can have it to download your study. In general, what have you seen? I mean, this argument makes sense to move away from export led model and more to increase wages so that you increase more the internal capacity of the internal market. What do you think are the counter arguments? Because there's some resistance, right? I mean, in an export-led model, President Sheinbaum is trying really hard to attract foreign investment, to also sit down with domestic industry for them to invest more in Mexico. But you're right, the issue of wages is not there. It might seem, I don't know if you've seen this, that maybe the argument for these investors is that, that's what makes Mexico attractive. And actually, foreign direct investment has been very healthy in Mexico. And maybe there's that tension, right, between keep at least the model, so you can keep the growth of the economy. Also, they're relying a lot on these, at least these very low economic growth for the cash payout programs that the government has built since Andrés Manuel López Obrador. How those political strategies do you think is impacting their lack of enthusiasm for these, what you propose, the policies that make total sense? Or is there something else, other things that we're not seeing? What's your assessment about the political incentives to adopt this model?
You've actually posed a knot of complex questions. And let me try to take out a few strands of that and offer my answers. And if I haven't satisfied all of your questions, come back and repeat them. In terms of the what I would call the complacency about investment, foreign direct investment, total investments, domestic and foreign, in the Mexican economy, as I said, amounts to, I have the exact number here, 21.4% of GDP. 21.4% of the overall size of the economy is all private sector investment. The average for other emerging economies is 28.3%. So 21 compared to 28 average for other emerging. So Mexico we can't consider the investment in Mexico a success story. It's not. It's a laggard. There has not been enough investment. Why has there not been enough investment? Because of this maquila model where the investment for export implies a lot of inputs that are imported. That has worked very well for these high profits for investors in Mexico. It's worked very well for this high share of the economy that goes to owners of capital as profit, but it's not enough for Mexico to break out of this low growth trap. They have not been able to get the momentum. As I say, economists generally converge like around 24, 25% of GDP and investment is required to get, what the speed that you can blast off, that would not blast off, but at least begin to grow in a dynamic way. Mexico does not have that. And that low figure of 21% of GDP includes the nearshoring surge, which has petered out, by the way. The nearshoring surge of investment hasn't happened this year, last year, the year before. It was basically an 18-month phenomenon of a certain period of time. That model is not working for Mexico, the investment model. The clinging to it, which, as you say, I mean, there are many forces in Mexico that want to cling to it, but it hasn't been working. So that's one argument. Why hasn't the government shifted over to this domestic demand-led model? They have shifted to domestic supply. Plan Mexico is really aiming to attract investment in some sectors that could be inputs to substitute for imports. But that's supply. It says nothing about who's going to buy that. The assumption still is it will be for exports. It still is clinging on to the export-led model. Why? I'm just going to offer you my personal opinion about this, but one of the propositions of President López Obrador, which has also been repeated by President Sheinbaum, was that the fourth transformation had to break the link between economic power and political power in Mexico. They said that the economic power in Mexico, this high share going to capital, the strength of the elite in Mexico was also the government. It was identified with the government. It was one and the same in effect with the government before the fourth transformation. This is their argument, that they had to break the link between political power and economic power. And I think that any fair observer would say that significant steps have been taken to break the political link, to make the political organization of the country not to be driven by the elites, by investors. But the economic power has not been reined in. And so when the elites say they don't want wage increases, they don't want strong unions, independent unions, and they don't want all of these steps that would increase the labor share, which would come at the expense of the capital share, they have been able to maintain that line, and the government has not been willing to take that on. I think there are people in the Mexican government at fairly senior levels who want to do that, who recognize the problem, who know that they need to shift to domestic demand away from export demand. But they have not been able to carry the day, win the argument. And there are plenty of people in the Mexican government at high levels, that in fact are quite comfortable with this sort of 2% a year growth. We know, people who spend time in Mexico know that there are two different lifestyles there. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Thank you. Why don't we move to some of the questions on the chat? Thank you to Meisho Lu, who asks, farmers are now on strike. How does the agricultural sector fit into this picture? Has sector not included in the USMCA? Not just farmers, but farm workers are affected since they do not have access to the rapid response mechanism. Go ahead, Sandra.
Yeah, well, first of all, the rapid response mechanism, should only be seen as a backup. Mexico should be enforcing its labor laws and protecting workers' rights, including in the agricultural sector, which is covered by Mexican law. I mean, there are some special provisions for the agricultural sector which were too weak, and some progress has been made by the Morena government on that, but not enough. But the rapid response mechanism, which should only be a backup, it's true, does not apply to the agricultural sector. And that is a big gap. It should be extended to apply really to any part of the economy, which is either involved in trade or involved in competition. That's the way the parameters of the RRM are described, that they affect any company that is trading or producing a good that competes. And so it should be extended to apply to agriculture. I absolutely agree with that. And I hope that the Mexican government will make that proposal.
Is there any sign that you see that they're prepared to include agriculture in these round of negotiations, Sandra? Have you seen any signs of what is your take on that?
There was a recent statement by which I read in the press by a senior official at STPS, the labor ministry, saying the first objective that Mexico would have in the negotiations with regard to the rapid response mechanism would be to make it applicable to the US and Canada without any loopholes, right? It's applicable to the US and Canada. I mean, it can be used, but first you have to go through the whole domestic process, which is very long. And for example, with the NLRB, people will understand that it can take years to try to get a case resolved, and it would still have to go to the courts for enforcement before Mexico could invoke the RRLM. So Mexico said they want that loophole to be dropped, and I completely endorse that. They have also mentioned in that context that they would like to see it extended to agriculture. And of course, they are thinking that if that loophole was dropped and they could use it for problems in the US covering agriculture, there are many, many Mexican workers who have complaints about their treatment in the agricultural sector in the US. So if Mexico does propose those reforms, and if they put the muscle behind demanding them, that would be a very, very good improvement.
Good, thank you. Let's moving on to another question by Robert Jeffcott. He writes, do the average wage figures include the social wage, such as Social Security, housing subsidies, and loans, profit sharing, bonuses, and aguinaldo?
No, they don't. No, the comparison I was making there was to the base wage. So the minimum wage doesn't include those either. So when I compare how the average wage has evolved compared to the minimum wage, this is without the year-end benefits and so on. I mean, that would have to be added on to both. So the comparison is apples to apples.
Okay, thank you. And then our colleague Ruben Hernandez Leon, the director of the Latin American Institute, writes, thanks for an excellent presentation, Sandra. I have a couple questions. Does the Mexican government have the leverage vis-a-vis capital to implement the policies you suggest? And second, how can the government enforce labor law if it's reducing the size of the state through its austerity measures?
So to the first question, and remind me to come back to the second one, please, Gaspar.
Sure.
Because the first question is important and complex. So the Morena government has the votes to pass things in the legislature if they hold their party together and if their two allies in the government vote with them. They can pass things, and in some cases they could pass things with only Morena representatives, elected officials, and a few others. Frankly, the problem there is I'm not sure if you could count on all of the Morena senators and representatives to support these things. I think if President Sheinbaum decided that this is the path that Mexico should take, it's time to begin taking these steps so that next year, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, they don't find themselves in the same situation, depending on US exports and therefore being vulnerable to the kind of arm twisting that they have faced. If they decide, yes, we need to begin to do this, I think that the president has the credibility to propose these things. They would be very popular with her base, just as the minimum wage increases were very popular with her base. This extension of these benefits to more middle income workers, middle income households, and workers above the minimum wage, but not wealthy. I think she would have the public behind her. She would have her base, and I think she could put that through. There would be resisted, but I just wanted to make an analogy there. When Mexico began to reform the labor law, because they had to, they were insisted that in order to get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, they would have to make those reforms. And so even Peña Nieto began with the constitutional reform in order to join the TPP. Well, then Trump got out of the TPP. Well, the reforms stalled. They were in the legislature, the constitutional reform had passed, but the implementing legislation was completely stalled. And most of the proposals went backwards. López Obrador said to the legislature in Mexico, we won't get the USMCA if you don't pass this. It's that simple. Well, President Sheinbaum could say the same thing. Now, we will not get through this review and this renewal and possible renegotiation without showing that we are going to have an upward convergence of wages. And so let's do it, and let's do it now. And the combination, I think, of popular support and her own integrity, pushing in a very good direction, very much in line with everything she said about her philosophy, I definitely think it's possible to do it now. Not easy, but possible. And this window of the review is the time to do it. Now, I forgot
Which is
the second
within a
question.
few months, right? It might be extended, but we don't have a lot of time, actually.
It should be started now. On the other hand, I don't think it will be settled in a few months.
Okay.
I think it will spill over. It will be several months or maybe even longer. But it should be started now. Yes, I agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I forgot the second question.
The second question is, how can the government enforce labor law if it's reducing the size of the state through its austerity measures?
Mexico cannot afford to reduce the size of the STPS and the CFCRL, the Federal Center. They are too small and too weak already compared to any standard of countries at their income level. They have to increase it, and government needs to find the money. I would argue that eventually there has to be a tax reform in Mexico. As I mentioned, they have the lowest taxes in the OECD, lower than any of the other emerging economies. Chile, Colombia, any of the other emerging economies have higher taxes. Mexico's taxes less than half of the OECD average. This is a longstanding problem. They've been pushed even by institutions like the World Bank and the OECD, who are not normally thinking about equity, but that the low tax take in Mexico has constrained many things, not only the enforcement of labor law and the protection of Mexican workers by the government, but it has constrained investment in infrastructure. It constrained investment in hospitals and schools. It's constrained spending on education and health that should be provided at a much higher level, considering Mexico's overall level of development. They're going to have to increase taxes in order to be able to do that.
Thank you for that. And Minshu Liu writes, some critics say that the Plan Mexico is still in the neoliberal mode, tax incentives for corporations rather than lifting from the bottom. AMLO could not afford to antagonize Mexican capitalists in order to begin the fourth transformation, the 4T. But it is time to do tax reform rather than continue on this path. But is it time to do tax reform and then continue this path?
Well, I think I just answered that. I think it's going to be impossible for Mexico to evolve as the kind of economy that it wants to be, to develop, to be the kind of society, the kind of polity that it wants to be, with such low levels of taxation. And not only are the taxes too low, the structure of tax in Mexico is very regressive. It doesn't redistribute in the way. So taxes have two purposes. I mean, if you go to a theory of taxation, one is to raise funds raise revenue so that the government can do the things it needs to do. And the other one is to redistribute income. And the tax system in Mexico now does neither. It doesn't raise enough in funds to do what the government needs to do, and it's regressive. It doesn't reduce. I just saw a very good article by some Mexican scholars who looked at the after-tax effects on the Gini figure, Gini, the measure of inequality. And they found that for the data that they had from OECD countries, including a number of emerging economies, that Mexican taxes had the least impact in reducing the Gini of any of those countries. And a lot of those countries don't have particularly progressive tax systems, but that just shows how regressive Mexico's is. So no, it's got to be part of the picture. If not this year, then next year. The longer it's put off, the longer Mexico will stay trapped in this slow growth, slow development quagmire, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. Thank you for that insight, Sandra. I wonder if you would be willing to answer a hypothetical question here, given the fact that you have so much experience, that you've been tracking these negotiations since NAFTA, and now in these current negotiations. What would be your advice for the Mexican team facing down the US team? And we have to remember that now the negotiations are between US and Mexico. Now, I don't know if they have added Canada still, but these are bilateral negotiations. That's how they're going to start. What would be your advice for the Mexican team? There are so many variables now, but what do you think should be the priority?
Well, the range of policies that I was talking about in order to begin this shift of the Mexican economy, not a U-turn, you can't do that, but to begin this shift that will take time to make consumption, domestic demand, the main driver of the economy. Those policies that I outlined would be 6 very concrete things that they could do. Many of them they can do themselves. But to go to the bargaining table, I would suggest that what Mexico should do is to say, we are going to embark on this path. We are going to commit to ourselves, to our country, that we are going to take these steps to increase wages. That should alleviate some of the US concern about jobs shifting from the US to Mexico. And Mexico should insist that the US not demand concessions that would make it harder for them to implement these changes. The US may come in with demands that constrict Mexico's policy space, whether it's around rights of investors. I mean, a number of the things that are in the USMCA that were in NAFTA limit Mexico's policy space. Mexico should resist that and should use the argument that it will be in the interest of the US and the entire North American economy if Mexico becomes more domestic demand driven, if there is more consumption in Mexico, which will be both of domestic goods and US goods and Canadian goods and others, that this in fact is a step to strengthening the North American economy. And they should use it to resist demands to constrict their policy space. That's general, but I think that that's the kind of package that I would put together.
Thank you. And let's close with this last question by Robert Jeffcott. And he writes, apologies if I missed this in your presentation, Sandra, but can the rapid response mechanism complaints be filed for an employer's failure to negotiate in good faith for an initial collective bargain agreement or revisions to the CBA? If not, should they be able to?
I'm not sure that I can give a direct answer to that, because if the employer has failed to bargain in good faith and in the course of doing that, say, pushes workers out onto strike because there hasn't been good faith bargaining. And while they're out on strike, the employer fires some, or as happened, unfortunately, at the rubber tire company a couple of weeks ago, the workers are attacked. I mean, shots are fired at them. If that failure to bargain in good faith in some way clearly violates rights of workers that they already have under Mexican labor law, yes, it absolutely could go to the RRLM. Some people argue that the Mexican labor law does not impose an obligation on employers to bargain in good faith. And I think that's a fair reading. I mean, you could construct and say, well, if you take everything into account, it amounts to that. But I think it is missing, and that could be one more area where Mexican labor law should be strengthened.